April 1944. Dawn broke over northern Scotland with a dim, pewter light that flattened the hills into ghostly silhouettes. The wind off the North Sea smelled of peat, salt, and diesel, an unlikely perfume for the birth of an army that did not exist. Captain David MacKinnon of No, 12 Commando, stood on a rise above Loch Erebol, hands jammed into the pockets of his battle dress, watching a bulldozer gouge a fresh scar through the bog. Its steel blade shuddered and bit, carving twin trenches deep into the sodden earth. Behind it, a team of sappers dragged a wooden rig the size of a wagon bed, its underside studded with rubber moulds cast from real truck tyres and tank treads. Every few yards they paused, lifted the contraption, shifted it sideways, and started again, creating the illusion of many vehicles turning, parking, dispersing. From above, on a Luftwaffe reconnaissance print, those trenches would look like an army on the move. To the men creating them, they were simply mud and madness. "Looks like we're building a road to nowhere, sir," Sergeant Tommy Briggs called over the engine's growl. "That's the idea," MacKinnon replied. "If Jerry thinks it leads somewhere, we've done our job." The job had been described in orders as special measures in support of Fortitude North. Few of the commandos knew what that meant. They only knew that since March, they had been trucked to desolate coves and heather-covered slopes across northern Scotland, setting up dummy landing craft, wooden tanks, and whole camps of empty tents. It was theatre of the highest stakes, part of a deception meant to convince Adolf Hitler that the Allies would invade Norway, not France. The morning drizzle thickened to mist. Farther down the slope, other details of the illusion took shape. Canvas and timber Shermans, painted dull olive, were positioned beneath nets. Inflatable fuel drums were arranged beside fake depots. A handful of men hammered posts for signal wire that carried no current. It all looked convincing from a distance, especially to a camera lens. A jeep jolted up the track, tyres flinging mud. Inside sat a young Royal Engineers officer, Lieutenant Cross, clutching a clipboard. He jumped out and saluted, rain dripping from his tin hat. "Sir, we've laid 40 yards of double-track impressions and 20 more of single-lane dispersal. Next site's up by the cove." MacKinnon nodded. "Good. We'll finish before dark. And remember, keep the prints irregular. Real drivers wander." Cross grinned. "Understood. Controlled untidiness," the colonel called it. "War by mud pies," Briggs muttered. At mid-morning, the bulldozer's engine cut out, coughing a final cloud of black smoke. The sappers unhooked the tyre rig and inspected their handiwork. The patterns were perfect, crisscrossed, rutted, and random enough to pass as weeks of heavy traffic. They led toward the sea, where a dozen dummy landing craft waited under camouflaged netting. The boats were nothing but wooden ribs wrapped in painted canvas, but from 10,000 feet they would look ready to sail. MacKinnon walked the line of tracks, boots sinking into the peat. To one side, a corporal set up a brazier, its smoke curling straight up in the still air. From above, it would mark a living camp, men cooking breakfast before embarkation. The deception planners in London had thought of everything: the exact size of latrine pits, the spacing of tents, even the pattern of vehicle shadows at noon. A signaller approached, cradling a field telephone. "Message from the bluff, sir. RAF reconnaissance bird lifting off from Wick. They'll be overhead in 20 minutes. "Right," MacKinnon said. "Make sure those dummies are uncovered. I want every fake tank smiling for the camera." The men moved quickly, pulling aside camouflage nets, straightening tent lines, and arranging crates into neat stacks. It felt absurd, playing dress-up for an enemy they would never see, but they did it with care. Somewhere over the North Sea, a mosquito with cameras in its belly was turning toward them, its lenses ready to capture every track and tent. The photographs would be developed, duplicated, and by channels no one in the field fully understood allowed to fall into German hands. By early afternoon, the mist burned away, revealing the sea like a slab of dull metal. Sunlight caught on the fake landing craft, glittering along their wet canvas sides. The Commandos broke for tea beside the bulldozer, mugs steaming in the chill air. You ever think, sir, Briggs said, that maybe this war's gone mad? We used to blow up bridges, now we build pretend ones. MacKinnon smiled thinly. Every ounce of fuel the Germans waste guarding Norway is one less shell landing on our lads in Normandy. I'll take madness over mortar fire. He did not add that he had lost half his troop at Dieppe 2 years earlier, in a raid that taught the British everything about what not to do. Now he preferred deception to blood. By 3 o'clock, the photo-recce Mosquito swept low over the loch, silver and silent. Its cameras clicked in rhythm. The men waved their caps. "Think Jerry will spot us?" a sapper shouted. "He'd better," MacKinnon answered. "That's the whole bloody point." Within days, those photographs would reach Luftwaffe analysts in Oslo, who would plot the new activity on their maps. They would see landing craft in highland bays, fresh tracks on remote hills, smoke from new camps. The phantom British Fourth Army, headquartered on paper in Edinburgh, would seem very real indeed. Its fictitious divisions, some British, some Canadian, even an American corps, would appear poised to strike across the North Sea towards Stavanger, Bergen, or Narvik. As evening came, the men began to pack their tools. The bulldozer was winched onto a lorry, the tyre rig strapped down. In the fading light, the churned hillside looked convincingly alive, tracks twisting toward the horizon, puddles gleaming like oil, tents casting long shadows. From the air it would look like the edge of an army. MacKinnon took one last look before climbing into the jeep. "All right, lads," he said. "Back to camp. Tomorrow we make another army somewhere else." They drove off into the mist, leaving behind only footprints and the illusion of might. The wind sighed across the empty ground, smoothing the peat around the ruts. That night, as darkness folded over the loch, the fake camp glimmered faintly under the moon. Fires burned in empty braziers, kept alive by timed flares. In the distance, a generator hummed beside the wooden landing craft, powering nothing but illusion. Somewhere in the black sky, a German reconnaissance plane droned southward toward its base in Denmark. Its cameras clicked, capturing what appeared to be the unmistakable signs of an invasion force forming in northern Scotland. By the time those negatives reached the map rooms of the Wehrmacht, 10 divisions would be marked in Norway's defence plan as on alert. All because, on a wet April day in 1944, a handful of British commandos had dragged a wooden frame with fake tyres across the Scottish mud, turning peat into proof and deception into a weapon. April 1944. Whitecaps rolled endlessly across the North Sea, slate-grey and bitterly cold, as if the ocean itself wished to conceal the reason why hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were still shivering in Norway. From Narvik to Stavanger, from the Arctic Circle to the Skagerrak, Wehrmacht divisions guarded a coastline no one intended to invade. Inside a timber operations hut at Fort William, Captain David MacKinnon listened as a visiting intelligence officer from London explained the logic that underpinned his unit's strange assignment. The man's uniform bore no insignia, his manner precise, clipped, and faintly amused. He spoke not of glory, but of arithmetic. 13 German divisions, he said, tapping a pencil against the map. That's what Hitler keeps in Norway. A full 1/10 of his fighting strength in the West. And why? Because he's terrified we'll come for his iron. He meant the iron ore shipped each winter from Sweden through Narvik metal that fed the steelworks of the Reich. Since 1940, Germany had occupied Norway to secure that lifeline and to control the northern sea routes. The occupation had cost them dearly. Mountain fighting, frozen supply lines, and endless garrisons had tied up troops better used elsewhere. Yet Hitler's obsession persisted. He called Norway Festung Norwegian Fortress Norway and refused every suggestion to reduce it. "Gentlemen," the officer continued, "our task is to keep him afraid. As long as he believes we'll land here," he jabbed the pencil at Trondheim, "those divisions will never leave, in their snowdrifts, and every soldier stuck in Norway is one less facing us in France." MacKinnon looked down at the map, tracing the fjords and islands. He had raided that coast 2 years before with 12 Commando, slipping ashore under midnight sun to demolish a fish oil factory used for explosives. They had fought for minutes, lost men for hours, and fled before dawn. To him, Norway meant bitter cold, iron cliffs, and comrades buried at sea. The idea that such misery could now be weaponized through illusion seemed almost comical. But in London, men like Colonel John Bevan of the London Controlling Section saw the matter differently. They called it Operation Bodyguard, a grand deception to shield the coming invasion of France. Its northern branch, Fortitude North, was the one that had brought MacKinnon to the Highlands with his wooden tyres. The plan was elegant: invent an army in Scotland, the British Fourth Army, and let German intelligence discover it. Radio operators would chatter in code about ski exercises and Arctic weather gear. Double agents under MI5's control would report seeing convoys moving north, American troops in strange winter uniforms, new insignia glimpsed on trucks. Then aerial photographs helpfully supplied by the RAF would confirm it all. The man from London folded the map. "We don't need to make them believe an invasion is coming tomorrow," he said. "Only that it might come any day. Hitler's mind will do the rest." Outside, rain began to fall, soft and steady. Briggs entered with a pot of tea, muttering that the stove smoked worse than the lorry engine. The intelligence officer accepted a mug, warming his hands. "Your fake tracks," he said, "are already paying dividends. Our intercept boys at Bletchley report increased Luftwaffe reconnaissance over Caithness and Rossshire. The Germans are looking, which means they're worried. That's all we need." MacKinnon exchanged a glance with Briggs. "Worried's fine," he said, "as long as they don't come here and check." "They won't," the officer replied. "The illusion's in the photographs. Once they've seen them, they'll defend the picture, not the place." When he left, driving south through sleet, MacKinnon walked to the loch's edge. Across the water, the mountains brooded under cloud, their slopes patched with the fading snow of early spring. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Norway occupied, fortified, and haunted by rumours of invasion. He thought of the German troops stationed along those fjords, sentries staring out at empty seas, listening for engines that never came, men like them, waiting for ghosts. In Oslo, those ghosts had already taken shape on paper. Luftwaffe intelligence reports in late March had noted increased British activity in northern Scotland, including concentration of landing craft and heavy equipment. Naval Command warned of possible amphibious operations directed against Norwegian coastlines. Even the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, forwarded agent reports describing an entire British army equipped for winter warfare. Hitler read those reports with satisfaction and paranoia. He ordered fresh reinforcements to Norway, declaring that the enemy will strike in the north to sever our iron lifeline. He would not permit the withdrawal of a single division to France. By mid-April, 13 German divisions, nearly 350,000 men, remained frozen in place. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft that might have strengthened the Atlantic Wall stayed guarding the wrong coastline. In a hut at Loch Erebol, MacKinnon's troop lit cigarettes and listened to the BBC's evening news. Nothing about deception, of course. The broadcast spoke of bombings in Germany, convoys to Russia, and Allied advances in Italy. None of it mentioned the quiet war waged by men dragging wooden frames through Scottish mud. Briggs exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "Do you think anyone'll ever know about this, sir? What we're doing?" MacKinnon shrugged. "If no one does, it means it worked." He walked outside. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet heather. Along the hillside, the day's work was already fading into dusk. The dummy landing craft sat motionless under their nets. The fake tank silhouettes cast long, convincing shadows, and the tyre tracks, still glistening with water, wound toward the loch like veins of deceit. He imagined a German photo interpreter, perhaps in an office in Oslo, peering through a magnifying glass at a blurry print, counting tracks, tracing roads. The man would note supply dumps, tents, landing craft and army ready to sail. He would mark his findings in red pencil and send them up the chain. Somewhere in Hitler's headquarters, a staff officer would brief the Führer on enemy concentrations in northern Scotland. And all of it, the maps, the orders, Immobilized divisions would be built on these muddy impressions in the highlands. As night fell, the wind shifted north, carrying the smell of the sea and diesel from a generator that powered nothing but a string of empty tents. The camp lights flickered to life, dim yellow bulbs glowing through the mist. From far above, they formed neat rows, each light a dot of falsehood shining into the dark. The ghosts were working. Late April, 1944. The rain had turned the fields outside Inverness into rivers of brown water. Across the Scottish Highlands, tents sagged under the weight of it, their guy ropes humming in the wind. Yet inside those dripping canvas cities, there were almost no soldiers, only carpenters, signallers, and illusionists in uniform. They were the builders of a ghost. The ghost had a name: the British Fourth Army. It appeared on official-looking orders, requisition forms, and wireless logs. It had divisions: the British 5th and the British 58th Infantry, an American Airborne Corps, and even a Canadian Armoured Brigade, all meticulously recorded in files stamped secret. None of them existed. Captain David MacKinnon received the news of their creation one morning from a courier out of Edinburgh. The envelope contained a typed order: No. 12 Commando will provide physical field signatures in support of Fortitude North, designated 4th Army operations. The rest of the page listed coordinates, supply depots, and instructions for temporary deception sites. MacKinnon read the phrase twice. "Physical field signatures," he said to Sergeant Briggs. "That's a fine way to describe a man digging fake wheel ruts." Briggs grinned. "We're ghosts now, sir. Better ghosts than corpses." From the beginning, the Fourth Army's life was written in static and paper. In a nondescript building near London's Regent Street, officers of the London Controlling Section drew up its structure. On wireless sets, scattered across Scotland, Royal Signals operators mimicked the radio chatter of entire corps. They spoke in clipped official tones, codes for rations, weather, movement orders, the sort of meaningless details that give weight to lies. The network was called Operation Sky. Every day, those signals bounced across the airwaves, easily intercepted by the Luftwaffe's listening posts in Denmark and Norway. German analysts plotted the volume of traffic on their charts and noted the steady growth of transmissions around Inverness, Aberdeen, and the Moray Firth. It looked, unmistakably, like an army assembling. But to be believed, the radio noise needed flesh, visible evidence that the wireless ghosts had bodies. That task fell to MacKinnon's Commandos and detachments of engineers from the Royal Engineers Camouflage Branch. They built everything to scale: dummy airfields with wooden Spitfires positioned at precise intervals, inflatable lorries painted with fake registration numbers, supply, dumps lined with crates filled not with ammunition but with sand. Each detail was rehearsed with the precision of a stage set. When an RAF reconnaissance plane flew overhead, the ground crews posed the dummies, arranged the tyre tracks, and even lit campfires to add activity. The photos would later be lost to channels known to reach German intelligence. One afternoon, MacKinnon stood with a civilian artist who had been drafted from Pinewood Studios. The man was overseeing the painting of fake tank shadows on tarpaulin sheets. He dabbed at the fabric with a brush, glancing at the sky. "Sun comes from the west in Germany's photos this time of year," the artist said. "If we get the angles wrong, it'll ruin the illusion." MacKinnon shook his head in disbelief. "We're painting shadows for a war." "Aye," said the artist, smiling faintly. "But it's cheaper than blood." Meanwhile, in London, deception officers worked with MI5's Double Cross. System the web of captured German agents turned to serve Britain. Men like Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, sent carefully crafted reports to their Abwehr handlers. They described convoys heading north, troop build-ups in the highlands, and shortages of Arctic clothing due to forthcoming operations. One message even mentioned a Fourth Army headquarters in Edinburgh Castle and American divisions training for winter warfare. Each false report reinforced the illusion. Within weeks, German analysts in Oslo concluded that a force of at least 150,000 men was preparing to strike across the North Sea towards Stavanger or Narvik. Hitler's own staff briefed him that British and American forces appear to be assembling in Scotland for major operations against Norway. By the end of April, Mackinnon's men were running on exhaustion and irony. They spent their days building camps that no one would inhabit, nights dismantling them to set up elsewhere, leaving behind the churned earth that betrayed departures. Their supply lorries carried nothing but empty barrels and rubber treads. During one break, Briggs stared at the vast expanse of peat and mist. "Do you think, sir, they'll ever give us medals for this?" Mackinnon laughed. "For what? Painting wheel tracks? No, Sergeant. If we succeed, no one will ever admit we were here." But already the ghosts were gaining weight. RAF interpreters reported that German reconnaissance flights were increasing over the Scottish coast. The Luftwaffe had begun photographing every inlet and cove. Intelligence summaries from Bletchley Park noted German message traffic referencing enemy concentrations in the Highlands. In early May, Mackinnon's unit received a new order: prepare for demonstration raids. These would be real commando attacks on the Norwegian coast, designed to keep the Germans nervous. Their fake army would soon be given a heartbeat of past scene, explosions and gunfire. That evening, as the sun dipped over the loch, Mackinnon walked alone through the dummy camp. The wind tugged at the tent ropes, making the canvas whisper. Beyond the ridgeline, the sea lay cold and immense, a sheet of grey steel stretching to Norway. Somewhere over that horizon, he imagined, German soldiers stood watching the waves, waiting for an invasion that would never come. He thought of them often, their fear, their vigilance, their sleepless eyes scanning for ships. In a sense, those men were his true audience. Every plank his engineers nailed, every false tyre print his sappers pressed into the mud, was a message sent to them. "We are coming." But they were not coming. The war Mackinnon fought now was one of silhouettes and rumours, a theatre of deceit. And in that strange quiet between storms, as the Highlands disappeared into twilight, he felt the weight of what they were building, a phantom army strong enough to hold back the real one. In the official reports, it would be called Fortitude North, physical implementation. In truth, it was something simpler and far more haunting, the day Britain learned that even ghosts could win battles. May 1944. The sea between Scotland and Norway was a corridor of fog and whispers. Beneath that silence, the real war rumbled elsewhere, bombers over France, tanks training on English soil, but here, in the North Atlantic winds, a quieter battle unfolded. The British called it Fortitude North, Phase 2. Captain David MacKinnon received his orders at dawn in a small operations hut near Durness. The paper was damp from the mist, the type blurred at the edges. It read, "Commando elements will execute limited seaborne raids designed to reinforce German expectations of invasion." It did not say that these raids were to be as false as the tracks in the peat. Around him, the men of No. 12 Commando gathered in their oilskins, steaming mugs of tea in hand. "Sergeant," Briggs skimmed the orders and gave a low whistle. "So, sir, we're to attack without attacking?" "That's right," Mackinnon replied. "We'll make noise in the dark and vanish before anyone sees us. Think of it as theatre, only the audience carries rifles." The plan came from London's Special Operations Branch. To strengthen the illusion of an army massing for Norway, a series of false landings would be staged along the Norwegian coast. Small craft would approach under cover of darkness, drop flares, fire blank ammunition, even set off demolition charges against empty rocks, all carefully timed to draw German spotlights and radio reports. The Royal Navy would provide a few old motor launches, stripped of identification and painted in the dull grey of plausible menace. By mid-May, rehearsals began off the Scottish coast. Under the moonless sky, the Commandos learned to choreograph deception. Signal flares burst over black water. Blank rounds echoed between cliffs. Radio operators shouted false coordinates into the ether. The exercise was absurd and deadly serious at once. On May 20th, Mackinnon's unit embarked on the first demonstration. The target was a remote fjord on Norway's western coast, chosen precisely because no one lived there. Their orders: make the enemy believe an invasion force had landed, then disappear. They sailed at dusk aboard 2 motor launches, engines throbbing softly through the swells. The air was bitter cold, thick with diesel and salt. MacKinnon stood at the bow, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The coastline appeared slowly black cliffs rising from the water, snow streaks glimmering under the pale northern light. 2 miles to shore, whispered the helmsman. No movement. MacKinnon nodded. Signal the other launch. Begin the fireworks. A flare hissed into the sky, casting the fjord in eerie green light. At once, the Commandos opened fire with blanks, the chatter of their Sten guns echoing off the cliffs. On cue, the engineers hurled explosive charges onto the rocks, thunderous blasts that sent plumes of spray skyward. A few men shouted orders in exaggerated tones. Hold the line! Bring up the second wave! From across the water, a Norwegian fishing village blinked into life searchlights sweeping, alarm bells ringing. Somewhere beyond the horizon, German coastal batteries would be waking, officers rushing to telephones, field radios crackling with reports of enemy landings. After 10 minutes, MacKinnon gave the order: withdraw. The men clambered back aboard, engines roaring as the boats turned seaward. Within an hour, they were swallowed by fog. By dawn, they were safely in open water, eating cold rations and laughing at the absurdity of it all. Briggs poured tea from a dented flask. You know, sir, he said, we may be the only men in history to win a battle no one fought. MacKinnon smiled. If the Germans waste 1 shell on an empty beach, I'll call that victory. Indeed, within 2 days, British intelligence confirmed their success. German radio intercepts from Bletchley Park revealed panic in coastal commands. Reports described enemy landing parties repelled and increased enemy naval activity between Bergen and Trondheim. Entire garrisons were placed on alert. Fuel reserves meant for training flights were diverted to coastal patrols. Encouraged, London ordered 2 more demonstration raids. Each followed the same pattern: noise, light, and smoke, followed by silence. One was staged off Ålesund, another near Egersund. The Germans reported both as major incursions, claiming to have sunk 2 enemy craft that never existed. The deception was working too well. By early June, German intelligence estimated that a force of at least 60,000 British troops was awaiting favourable weather for a Norway operation. They even identified the supposed commander, General Sir Andrew Thorne, who, in reality, commanded only a few training divisions in Scotland. For MacKinnon's men, the success felt hollow. They returned to their hidden camps in the Highlands, their vehicles deflated, their dummy landing craft patched with paint. The real invasion, Operation Overlord, was only weeks away, and they knew that while their ghosts haunted the north, the real war would thunder ashore in France. Yet the deception remained vital. If Hitler kept his forces in Norway through June, fewer would be waiting for the Allies in Normandy. Every fake raid, every false track, every shadow of a tank was part of that unseen battle. On the night of June 5th, the eve of D-Day, MacKinnon received a coded message from London. Fortitude North confirmed effective. Enemy reserves held in Norway. Continue operations until further notice. He folded the paper carefully, tucked it into his pocket, and looked out across the loch. The wind was sharp, the sky clear. Somewhere to the south, under that same moonlight, real men were boarding real ships for the coast of France. Briggs joined him, lighting a cigarette against the wind. So it's happening then? MacKinnon nodded. Aye, and thanks to us, there'll be fewer Germans to meet them. He said nothing more. The night stretched silent and endless, the kind of stillness that only comes before history moves. Out on the empty hills, the fake tracks glistened with dew. From above, they still looked real proof of armies that never were, preparing for battles that would never come. And somewhere across the sea, in bunkers along the Norwegian coast, German officers stared into the darkness, listening for engines that would never arrive. June 1944. The world had shifted overnight. Allied ships filled the English Channel, and the beaches of Normandy were fire and thunder. Yet far to the north, in the cold expanse between Scotland and Norway, the war was silent, and that silence was the sound of victory. Captain David MacKinnon learned of the landings by wireless just after dawn on June 6th. The message came through crackling static from London. Operation Neptune executed. Assault proceeding. He read it aloud to his men inside the dripping canvas of their makeshift headquarters near Loch Erebol. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Sergeant Briggs exhaled, half laughing, half in disbelief. "So it's begun," he said. "All that mud and fakery bought them their chance." MacKinnon nodded. "Now let's make sure it stays bought." Their part in the invasion was far removed from the gunfire on French sand. Yet, in the calculus of deception, their work mattered no less. If the Germans believed a second blow was still coming from Scotland to Norway, then the first blow in Normandy could grow into triumph. The Ghost Army had to keep breathing. That day, new orders arrived from London. Continue all deception activity. Maintain full radio traffic and visual evidence until further. Notice: German divisions remain committed in Norway. The message meant one thing: the illusion had worked. Allied code breakers at Bletchley Park had already intercepted frantic German signals. Reports from Oslo described enemy landings anticipated along the Norwegian coast. In Berlin, Hitler himself ordered General Jodl to keep all northern forces in readiness, convinced that the Normandy landings were merely a feint. For the next several weeks, while the beaches of France ran red, Mackinnon's commandos fought a quieter battle against disbelief and weather. Their dummy camps had to look alive under the eyes of German reconnaissance cameras. Crews inflated and repositioned rubber tanks, dragged tyre rigs through the sodden peat to suggest traffic, and even staged parades of silhouettes under canvas. One evening, an RAF reconnaissance Mosquito swooped low over the camp to photograph the display. The men stood by their fake vehicles, faces smeared with mud and amusement. When the aircraft passed, Briggs muttered, "Some poor German will spend a week studying that photo, counting shadows." He was right. Within days, decrypted intercepts confirmed that Luftwaffe analysts in Norway had marked the pictures as proof of continued British build-up. In the margins of one report, a German intelligence officer had scribbled, "Fourth Army activity increasing possible imminent action towards Stavanger sector." The words reached Hitler's desk by June 10th. Furious, he berated his generals for diverting reserves to France, insisting that the main attack will come in the north. Orders went out to keep 13 divisions in Norway, over 300,000 men, dozens of aircraft and hundreds of artillery pieces frozen in place. From the moors of Scotland, Mackinnon's ghosts were holding an army. Each morning began with routine deception. Sappers renewed the tyre marks carved into the mud. Signal operators sent streams of false traffic about, training schedules and shipping shortages. RAF crews dropped empty fuel drums on remote beaches to simulate supply dumps. Even the Navy joined in, anchoring a handful of rusting barges in sheltered coves and labelling them assault craft on forged manifests. Despite the monotony, the men understood the stakes. Rumours of casualties in Normandy trickled north, grim reminders of what failure would cost. Some nights, Mackinnon sat alone outside his tent, listening to the wind scrape through the heather. He could almost hear the far-off thunder of real war, the rumble of artillery across the channel. Briggs joined him one night, carrying a flask of whiskey liberated from a quartermaster's store. "Funny, isn't it?" he said. "We started this to make the Germans afraid of shadows. Now I think we're starting to believe in them ourselves." Mackinnon took the flask. "Aye," he said quietly. "Because they're working. Those shadows are saving men's lives." By late June, confirmation arrived from the highest source. A captured German signal decrypted at Bletchley reported that Hitler had again refused to release his Norway divisions, declaring, "The northern blow has not yet fallen." The illusion held firm. On the 21st of June, a thick fog rolled in from the sea, blanketing the highlands. The camp was silent except for the hum of the generator powering empty tents. To anyone passing through, it would look deserted. To a camera at 20,000 feet, it looked alive, a base preparing for war. That same day, German reconnaissance flights over the Scottish coast doubled. Analysts in Oslo concluded that weather delays have postponed the northern invasion. In truth, the only delay was in the wind clearing the fog. As July approached, the deception reached its peak. Allied planners in London estimated that the Norwegian garrison, still numbering more than 300,000, remained at full readiness. Meanwhile, the real battle in France had broken through at Saint-Lô, beginning the drive toward Paris. Every tank, every German gun trapped in Norway meant fewer resisting in Normandy. MacKinnon received one last message on the final day of June: Fortitude North objectives achieved. German High Command continues to overestimate Allied strength in Scotland, maintain deception until August. He read it twice, then looked out across the loch. The hills were quiet, the water silver under the fading sun. All around him stood the artifacts of their strange war-painted canvas, rubber tanks, wooden trucks, and endless lines of fake tracks glinting with rain. "Think they'll ever know?" Briggs asked beside him. MacKinnon shook his head. "They'll write about Normandy, Sicily, Italy, all the real battles. No one will remember the ghosts." Briggs smiled faintly. "Then we'll haunt them in peace." As darkness fell, a distant aircraft droned overhead. It was German, one of the few still, patrolling the northern sea routes. Its cameras clicked, capturing the flicker of campfires and the faint glow of lamps through tent flaps. Another photograph for another file in Oslo. Another reason for the enemy to keep waiting for an invasion that would never come. And as that reconnaissance plane turned homeward over the Black Sea, the ghosts of Scotland, the wooden tanks, the fake tracks, the men who played at war so that others could win it remained in their lonely camps, silent sentinels of a deception that had reshaped the course of history. August 1944. The highlands had turned gold with heather, and the phantom army that had fooled the Reich for months began to fade with the summer light. For Captain David MacKinnon and the men of No. 12 Commando, the order came without ceremony: Fortitude North to be wound down, physical signatures to be erased. Erased, that was the word. Not removed, not dismantled. Erased, as though their months of labour were a smudge on history. By then, Operation Fortitude had achieved the impossible. Hitler still held 13 divisions, nearly a third of his northern strength in Norway. Even as Allied armies surged across France toward Paris, German officers in Oslo continued to send frantic reports of imminent invasion. They had charted phantom divisions, counted fake ships, and measured tyre tracks carved by rope rigs through Scottish mud. The illusion had cost nothing in blood, yet bent the trajectory of the war. Now that illusion had to vanish. MacKinnon stood in the drizzle at dawn, watching engineers deflate a line of rubber Shermans. The canvas folds sighed like tired lungs as the air hissed out. Each tank collapsed into a heap of limp fabric, its painted gun barrel drooping like a dying branch. Beside him, Sergeant Briggs stamped out a cigarette. "Strange, isn't it, sir? All that work, and it ends with a few pinholes." MacKinnon nodded. "That's the point, Sergeant. The best. Lies leave no evidence." The men worked in silence. They stripped signs from fake headquarters, pulled up wooden telephone poles that had carried no wires, and scattered straw over the bare ground to hide the false ruts. Dummy supply dumps were burned, plywood aircraft dismantled and fed to bonfires that smoked grey against the mist. Within days, the sprawling camps around Loch Eribol and Dornoch were bare fields once again. Only the ghosts remained in memory: the sound of rubber rustling in the wind, the smell of wet canvas, the distant echo of blank gunfire during those phantom raids. Yet London had not forgotten them. From the War Office came a terse signal commending their exceptional contribution to overall deception strategy. It was unsigned, sealed with a stamp of secrecy. To the outside world, Fortitude North did not exist. For MacKinnon, that secrecy was both pride and burden. He had commanded a campaign that could never be spoken of, an army that had never lived. On his final day in Scotland, he walked the perimeter of the empty field that had once been their headquarters. The wind off the North Sea carried the scent of salt and peat. He paused beside the last remaining object, a single painted sign that read, 4th Army, Vehicle Park B. The paint was flaking, the post leaning slightly in the wet ground. He stared at it for a long time before taking it down. Across the North Sea, the consequences of their work lingered. Intercepted German transmissions in late August still warned of enemy concentrations in northern Britain. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's directive to the Norwegian command on August 20th ordered continued readiness for Allied landing before autumn storms set in. Even as Paris was liberated and Allied columns crossed the Seine, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers remained locked in defensive positions guarding empty fjords. The absurdity was not lost on the men who had created it. During their demobilization at Inverness, Briggs raised a toast in the dim light of the officers' mess. "To the army that never was," he said, lifting a chipped enamel mug of beer. "May it rest in peace and never be mentioned again." The room erupted in laughter, but behind it was fatigue, the quiet exhaustion of men who had lived too long with lies. When the unit disbanded, most went on to other duties. Some joined new Commando operations in France, others transferred to engineer units preparing for the Far East. MacKinnon was sent to London for debriefing, where a colonel from the London Controlling Section handed him a file marked Classified Fortitude Series. "You understand, Captain," the colonel said, "that what you've done will not be recorded publicly. The success of Fortitude North depends on silence. The Germans must never know how they were fooled." MacKinnon nodded. "And after the war?" The colonel hesitated. "Perhaps then. But wars have long memories and short gratitude." He closed the file, and with it, the chapter of his invisible army. Months later, when winter came again to the Highlands, the traces of their presence had vanished beneath snow and silence. The heather reclaimed the churned soil, and only faint depressions in the peat hinted where the fake convoys had once rolled. Shepherds returning to the hills found scraps of rubber and twisted wire, and wondered what strange training had taken place there. In Berlin, long after defeat was certain, Hitler still clung to the mirage. In December 1944, he ranted to his staff that the British will yet strike through Norway. Even as the Reich collapsed, divisions remained idle in the frozen north, waiting for a battle that would never come. The ghosts of Scotland had outlasted their makers. Years later, historians would uncover fragments of the truth-coded documents, declassified maps, and grainy aerial photographs showing lines of tanks that had never moved. But for those who lived it, the memory was sharper. Briggs would later recall the final night before they left the Highlands. "We stood by the loch watching the fires burn down," he said in an interview decades later. "There was nothing left but smoke and stars. I remember thinking, somewhere out there, men are dying for a war we helped win by pretending to fight it." Captain David MacKinnon never spoke publicly about Fortitude North. He retired from the army in 1948, took up teaching, and kept the commendation letter folded in a drawer until his death. On the back of it, written in his own hand, were the words, "Victory sometimes wears an invisible uniform." By then, the real invasion of Norway had never come. It didn't need to. The phantom army of Scotland had done its work so well that the enemy had guarded against shadows until the end. In the secret arithmetic of war, where deception saves lives and silence writes history, MacKinnon and his men had waged the quietest campaign of all, a battle fought with tyre tracks, fake radios, and the courage to vanish once victory was won. September 1944. The war in Europe was tilting decisively toward its end. Paris had been liberated, Allied columns were pushing toward the German border, and yet astonishingly the German High Command still believed an invasion of Norway might come before winter. That belief now rested upon a single photograph. It had been taken weeks earlier, on a clear morning over the Moray Firth. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane, flying at 30,000 feet, had risked a long-range mission across the North Sea. Its camera, an ARB 75 over 30 Zeiss lens mounted under the fuselage, captured a mosaic of overlapping images as it roared over the Scottish coast. When those images reached Oslo, German analysts pieced them together into one panoramic frame nearly 6 feet long. To their eyes, the evidence was undeniable. A concentration of ships near Cromarty, tented encampments on the moors, and the faint geometric lines of what looked like vehicle parks and fuel dumps. They circled the details in red pencil and sent the report to Berlin with the annotation, 4th British Army preparing for operations toward Trondheim sector. What they were looking at, of course, was the last ghost still haunting the Highlands. Captain David MacKinnon had left Scotland weeks earlier, but his handiwork remained. The fake landing craft, rusting barges painted in camouflage and beached in the shallows, had not yet been dismantled. The Royal Engineers had left several dummy fuel tanks near the waterline, nothing more than painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. Even the pattern of tyre ruts carved into the peat remained visible in the sunlight, preserved by the dry weather. From above, it looked real. From 30,000 feet, it looked like an army. By early September, the reconnaissance photographs had reached Hitler's personal intelligence brief. The Führer's reaction was predictable. He slammed the table, shouting that the British deception continues to unfold. See, the proof is in their own negligence to hide it. His staff tried to suggest that the images might be old or misinterpreted, but Hitler would not hear it. Orders went out again to reinforce Norway, diverting yet more men and supplies away from the Western Front, where they were desperately needed. In the dim office of the London Controlling Section, a handful of officers read the decrypted German message and exchanged weary smiles. The Phantom Army still lived, sustained now by its afterimage. When the intercept reached the Fortitude planners, a memorandum circulated with quiet satisfaction. Enemy retains northern defensive posture. Photographic misinterpretation confirms persistence of deception signatures. It was bureaucratic language for something miraculous. Even after the props were gone, the illusion continued to operate, under its own inertia. Meanwhile, in Oslo, German Colonel Friedrich Pohlmann of the 17th Army Staff grew uneasy. He had begun to suspect something was wrong. His patrols along the coast had found no evidence of real preparations, no submarine activity, no intercepted radio chatter in the North Sea. The supposed British Fourth Army never appeared on signals intelligence, yet the photographs were irrefutable, or so everyone in Berlin insisted. In a diary entry dated September 22nd, later recovered by Allied interrogators, Pohlmann wrote, "I fear we are fighting shadows. The maps show divisions that have never fired a shot. The men grow restless, waiting for ghosts." The ghosts, meanwhile, continued to serve their purpose. Each week, ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park confirmed that German divisions remained static along the Norwegian coast. Ammunition shipments intended for the Western Front were still being sent north in preparation for the British landing. Even the Kriegsmarine kept destroyers stationed in Trondheim fjord, their fuel rationed to fumes, guarding a coast that would never be attacked. Back in London, Captain MacKinnon was working in the shadows again, attached now to the deception planning for operations on the Rhine. But his thoughts often returned to the Highlands. When a liaison officer from the Admiralty brought him a stack of reconnaissance prints, one caught his eye. It was the same Luftwaffe photograph that had fooled Berlin, captured by Allied intelligence from a downed German aircraft. He studied it for a long time, tracing the faint outlines of the fake barges and the hollow tanks. "Incredible," he murmured. "They're still believing in shadows." The liaison officer laughed. "You painted those ghosts well, Captain." MacKinnon didn't laugh. "It isn't paint. It's faith. Theirs." For the German troops in Norway, that faith became a kind of madness. The endless state of alert night patrols. Scanning the horizon, coastal guns manned through freezing rains drained morale. When the war finally ended in May 1945, many of those garrisons surrendered without firing a shot. One officer reportedly told his British captors, "We waited 2 years for you to come. You never did. We began to think perhaps we were the decoys, not you." The famous photograph that had misled the Reich disappeared into the archives after the war. When declassified decades later, analysts marveled at its perfection. The light angle, the texture of peat mistaken for camouflage netting, the way shadows from the moorland rocks aligned just enough to mimic rows of vehicles. Chance had completed the deception that man had begun. For MacKinnon, who lived to see that photograph printed in a post-war intelligence journal, it was both triumph and melancholy. In a letter to a former comrade, he wrote, "Our ghosts lasted longer than we did. Perhaps that is how lies become history when no one remains to explain the truth." By autumn 1944, the Northern Phantom was finally allowed to die. The last German reconnaissance flights over Scotland ceased as fuel ran out. The fake tracks had long since washed away in the rain, the barges rusted into the tide. Yet their shadow lingered on in German memory, and in one fading photograph, misread by desperate men who had once believed an empire could outguess the truth. And so it ended as it began, with images in the mist, men chasing reflections, and a war won not just by armies, but by the quiet power of illusion. October 1944. London was cold and grey, its buildings scarred by years of war. In the underground offices of the London Controlling Section, the nerve centre of British deception planning, Captain David MacKinnon sat before a desk stacked with files stamped "Most Secret." He had been recalled from Scotland not for rest, but for another ghost. This time, it was not a phantom army, it was a man. The deception had evolved. As the Allies prepared for their final drives into Germany, planners sought to keep Hitler distracted by convincing him that new invasions were imminent, some through the Balkans, others through Norway still. Fortitude North, it seemed, would not die quietly. The Germans remained half convinced that a British army still waited in the Highlands, poised to strike. To sustain that illusion through winter, they needed proof of life, radio messages, supply shipments, and most persuasive of all, a commander. Thus was born General Henry Cavendish, commander, 4th British Army, an entirely fictional officer. MacKinnon was tasked with creating him. He read the memo from Colonel Dennis Wheatley, head of deception planning. "The Germans require a name to believe in. You will provide them with one." The file contained the skeleton of a biography. Born 1888, educated at Harrow and Sandhurst, served in the Great War, wounded at Ypres. A. Staff posting in India, a mention in dispatches during the North Africa campaign. His current assignment, commanding forces in northern Scotland for Operation Hardihood, a phantom invasion of Norway. Every detail was calculated to sound plausible to German intelligence. The file included forged signatures, doctored photographs, and even a counterfeit entry in the army list printed by the War Office. Somewhere in Berlin, analysts scanning captured records would find Cavendish's name and nod grimly, confirming their worst fears. MacKinnon found the task both absurd and strangely personal. He knew that if he crafted the story too perfectly, men would die in Norway waiting for Cavendish's armies. But if he failed, the Germans might redeploy those same troops to France, where Allied soldiers were already bleeding through the hedgerows. Deception had always been a moral equation, lies told to save lives. For weeks, MacKinnon and a handful of intelligence officers built their ghost. They forged correspondence between Cavendish and fictitious subordinates, memos discussing supply delays, complaints about Norwegian weather, and coded reports of training progress. A clerk from MI5 posed as Cavendish's adjutant, sending letters to other fabricated officers stationed in Aberdeen, Inverness, and Kirkwall. Each letter was intercepted by the Germans exactly as intended. The wireless deception began soon after. Signal units in northern Scotland broadcast regular traffic under call signs assigned to the Fourth Army. The messages were meaningless, pre-arranged code words mixed with random chatter, but to German listening posts in Norway, they sounded like life. General Cavendish was talking to his command. On October 27th, Bletchley Park confirmed success. Intercepted Enigma traffic revealed that German intelligence had updated their order of battle to include 4th British Army, Commander Lieutenant General H.R. Cavendish, headquarters, Inverness. The Phantom Army now had a face and a voice. MacKinnon stared at the decoded message in silence. "We've created a man," he murmured, "and he already outranks me." The staff laughed, but uneasily. That winter, the legend of General Cavendish grew. The Germans believed he commanded 3 divisions, supported by the Royal Navy's fictitious 18th Carrier Squadron. Newspapers in neutral Sweden published rumours fed quietly by British intelligence that Cavendish had dined with Norwegian resistance leaders. A BBC broadcast mentioned him briefly in passing, an offhand remark by a war correspondent describing General Cavendish's northern formations training in Arctic conditions. It was enough. The illusion was self-sustaining. In Oslo, German General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, still responsible for Norway's defence, reinforced his coastal divisions. Hitler sent personal orders, praising his vigilance against the British northern threat. Nearly 400,000 Axis troops remained frozen in place through the entire winter of 1944, all for a man who never existed. MacKinnon's role ended quietly. By December, the deception files were sealed and stored in the archives at Whitehall. He was transferred again, this time to assist with post-liberation intelligence in France. On his last day at the controlling section, he lingered before the cabinet where Cavendish's papers were kept, the letters, photographs, and signatures that had given life to an illusion. He ran his hand across the folder's worn edge. "Goodbye, General," he said softly. After the war, the story of Fortitude North and its ghosts remained buried in classified files. But among German officers interrogated in 1945, the name Cavendish appeared repeatedly. One colonel insisted he had seen reports of the man personally commanding exercises near Inverness. Another claimed his agents had confirmed Cavendish's presence by eyewitness observation. The myth had become fact in enemy memory. Years later, when those documents were declassified, historians marveled at how deeply the deception had taken root. Not only had the Germans believed in an invasion that never came, they had invented an entire command structure to support it. In the secret war of imagination, Britain had not just moved fake armies across maps. It had created people. For Captain David MacKinnon, the lesson was clear. In war, truth could be a weapon, but lies, when wielded with precision, could move divisions. And so, in a smoky basement in wartime London, a handful of officers had proven that sometimes the most effective soldier was the one who had never been born. The man who never existed ended the same way the ghosts in Scotland had, without a trace, leaving only victory in his absence.